The controversial issue of internet surveillance reached a whole new level in 2013. That year we learned, thanks to Edward Snowden, that the NSA has been surveilling the digital communications of millions of people worldwide. How can this be? What does it mean, and what can we do about it? Well, first things first, the rules of the game. Everything we do online, absolutely everything, leaves a trace. What we call sending information is more like copying information. However magical it may seem, Skype is not a connection just between two computers. Video calls, like everything else, are sequences of ones and zeros, and that information, due to the internet's architecture, is copied many times before it reaches its destination. That is to say that there's only one thing keeping information secret: cryptography. A good deal of online data is encrypted, so that third parties will not be able to read it even if they could see it. Regardless, surveillance is still possible in this scenario. There is a blunt approach that involves tapping the wires that make up the internet, the very ones that we mentioned in another video. A second strategy is to force the private companies that collect data about us to share their information when there is a legal justification to ask for it. However, the recent scandal goes far beyond this. Thanks to the Snowden leaks, we learned that the NSA, in collaboration with its British counterpart, managed to compromise the private networks that connect data centers from Google and Yahoo worldwide. These networks are not part of the internet, and the information that can be found there is not encrypted. To make matters worse, we also learned that the NSA had a contract with the RSA, a company that sells encryption programs to other companies. That means that they were selling insecure systems to their clients. So yes, there is an enormous amount of information about all of us, and there are also ways for that information to end up in the hands of those in charge of surveillance. But the story does not end there. We have to keep in mind something that often gets overlooked. Namely, that surveillance in the digital world is not just about the information that you send and receive, but also and mostly about data mining. That is, combining large amounts of information in order to find patterns. Intercepting communications is for rookies. The true art of surveillance is all about the interpretation of metadata. For example, the GPS on your phone tells us exactly where you've been, but when we compare that with someone else's GPS, we can also know that you were together in a certain place at a certain time. Does that frighten you? The number of things that can be inferred by analyzing data is downright amazing. Many people were uncomfortable already knowing that, for example, Target has a database that allows them to identify when a woman is pregnant by studying how their consumption habits change. Things only get worse when we consider that governments can also infer this much information about us. It has never been easier to study our behavior so precisely. The question we must ask ourselves is, for what purpose are we being watched? We should note that the data we produce daily is valuable in many ways, and that is why there are so many people interested in compiling and analyzing all that information. Some use it to tackle social and scientific problems. Some use it to build business models, like Facebook, and some use it to keep an eye on the population. That leaves us with a huge problem of trust. Can we be sure that this information will be used for the good of society? Obviously, we cannot answer that question here, but what we can do is to argue that surveillance is not an issue that only criminals need be concerned about. For starters, our personal information has different meanings in different contexts. That is the reason why it is so difficult to give a definition of privacy that encompasses all things that we may consider to be private, but that vary from culture to culture and person to person. Ultimately, our right to privacy is the right to control how certain information about ourselves is interpreted, and that involves making decisions about the context in which we want our personal data to be known. The NSA never gave us that choice. Another reason why this is not just a problem for criminals is that, in a way, we might all be criminals. It may sound weird because it's not something that we often think about, but the fact is that frameworks are never perfect. On the contrary, there are so many laws and they are sometimes so ambiguous that we all end up breaking the law without realizing it. In any case, it is almost impossible to find a person who has never broken any laws willingly. Let he who has never downloaded an MP3 cast the first stone. The threat that follows from this argument is the possible use of selective justice. If it is true that there is information that could be used against each of us, that in itself threatens activists, journalists, politicians, and in general anyone with a potentially high profile, which is harmful for any society. It is still quite an overstatement to say that we live in a world like the one described in 1984, George Orwell's famous work, so often quoted in this debate. But this topic deserves your attention nonetheless, and this issue has become a part of the cultural and political landscape of the internet. What was once feared as a hypothetical scenario proved to be very real the moment Snowden blew the whistle on the NSA. We now know for sure that governments, both in the US and in other countries, do indeed monitor the behavior of citizens within and beyond their boundaries. They do it in the name of security, a sensible cause. But security also serves as an excuse for all kinds of abuses because it is a task that never ends. Thus, private information about hundreds of millions of innocent people is gathered in the hope of hunting a fistful of criminals, and no matter how many rights are violated along the way, they can always argue that security and privacy are mutually exclusive. Well, are they? Is it possible to strike a better balance? We must realize that we need to integrate other terms into this discussion because it is more complicated than that. We must talk about proportionality, transparency, civil liberties, and principles that help us to live in this era marked by the abundance of information. Which brings us to the last question. What can we do about it? There are basically two strategies that reflect the structure of this topic, one for the private sphere and one for the public. You can learn to protect the information that you want to keep private by using encryption and other tools. There are many online tutorials that explain how to do this. The second is to help build a legal system that guarantees the rights of everyone. Along these lines, you can support proposals such as 13 international principles on the applications of human rights to communication surveillance. Links can be found in the description.